So imagine you are the lead engineer of like a high-performance race car.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Right. And for the first few decades after this car is built, your entire job, the only thing you are absolutely obsessed with is just acceleration.
Just making it go faster.
Exactly. You keep putting in bigger engines, you pump in more fuel, you're just trying to push this machine's horsepower to the absolute limit so you can dominate the track. And, well, it works.
You get the speed.
Yeah, you hit these blinding, unprecedented speeds. But then when the car reaches, say, a cruising speed of 200 miles per hour, the nature of your job completely flips.
Right, because now the problem isn't just pushing the pedal to the metal anymore.
Exactly. Suddenly you notice the tires are degrading really fast, the engine temperature is dangerously high, and the whole chassis is just shaking violently from the sheer stress of maintaining that speed.
It's vibrating out of control.
Right. And you realize that keeping this car stable on the track without it completely shaking apart is actually a much, much more complex engineering problem than just, making it go fast in the first place.
That is such a perfect analogy because that vibrating high-speed race car is exactly what we're unpacking today. We're talking about global high-income countries.
Welcome to today's deep dive, everyone.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Today, we have this incredibly expansive World Bank data set. It tracks high-income economies, or HICs, all the way from 1960 up to 2024.
Which is just a massive span of time. We get to see the whole dashboard of these economic engines.
We really do. And our mission today is to decode the storyline of the world's wealthiest nations. Like, how do they get so rich? And now that they have this high-income status, what are these massive demographic and environmental walls they're suddenly hitting?
Right, because the warning lights flashing on the dashboard today are things we haven't seen in the last 60 years. It's this transition from a growth miracle to a phase of, well, system maintenance.
And if you're listening right now, you might be thinking, why should I care about macroeconomic data from decades ago?
Oh, you should definitely care.
Seriously. Whether you live in one of these high-income nations and you're trying to figure out why the data says we're so rich, but paying rent feels impossible.
Yeah.
Or maybe you live in a developing economy that's looking at these rich countries as a blueprint for the future.
Yeah, this deep dive is going to completely reframe how you look at growth, aging, and honestly, the future of the planet.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because being a high-income country is clearly no longer about wild industrial expansion. It's about managing this really delicate, aging, service-driven machine.
And before we even touch the money aspect, we have to talk about the people.
Right.
Because the most profound shift we're seeing in high-income countries isn't in their bank accounts, it's in their population pyramids.
The demographic earthquake.
Exactly. The foundation is literally shrinking. Look at the kids.
Yeah, the shrinking of the youth demographic is wild. In 1960, kids aged 0 to 14 made up 29.1% of the population in these countries.
Almost a third.
Almost a third. And by 2023, that number just plummeted down to 16.1%.
Which is a structural shock. It's not a blip.
So imagine a city that spent decades building elementary schools, right? Laying down soccer fields, putting up playgrounds.
Yeah.
And then suddenly, the mayor looks around and realizes they need to convert half of those schools into physical therapy centers and retirement communities.
Because the kids just aren't there anymore.
Right. And at the exact same time, the other end of the demographic spectrum is just exploding.
Oh, the graying population. It's massive.
The 65 and older demographic surged from around 8.2% back in 1960 to a massive 19.6% today.
1 in 5 people. And what's fascinating here is the economic mechanism behind this. It's called the dependency ratio.
Break that down for us. What does that actually mean for the average taxpayer?
Well, the dependency ratio measures how many non-working people, so kids and retirees, need to be supported by the working age population.
Got it.
Back in the 60s and 70s, these countries had this huge demographic dividend, a massive pool of young workers, a giant tax base, and very few elderly people to support.
So the economy just flew like a rocket.
Exactly. But now that equation is completely inverted. The labor pool is shrinking, but that smaller group of young workers has to carry the structural strain of Social Security, pensions, and just sky-high healthcare costs for a massive elderly population.
And speaking of healthcare, we have to talk about the life expectancy data because it's a huge part of this puzzle.
It really is. It's a story of incredible triumph, honestly.
Right. Total life expectancy in these countries went from 3 years in 1960 to a peak of 80 years in 2019.
That's almost a 12-year jump. It's phenomenal.
It is. And a big reason is that infectious diseases were largely defeated. Baseline immunizations, like for measles, have stayed above 90% for a long time.
So people aren't dying from those things anymore.
Right, they are living long enough to get non-communicable diseases. Things like cardiovascular disease and cancer are now the primary causes of death.
Yeah, and that completely changes what the healthcare system actually has to do.
How so?
Well, the old system was designed for acute interventions. You get an infection, you get antibiotics, it's cheap, and you either get better or you don't.
Right.
But managing a chronic illness like heart disease or cancer takes decades. It requires massive amounts of doctors, nurses, expensive equipment. The data shows high-income countries now have about 3.7 doctors per 1,000 people.
That's a lot of resources tied up in chronic care.
Exactly. And government spending on health is over 70% of total health expenditure.
But wait, I have to push back here for a second. We always assume the line just goes up, right? That medicine just keeps making us live longer.
Yeah, that's the general assumption.
But the data shows a really sharp drop in life expectancy down to 79.5 years in 2021. Obviously, that's the COVID-19 shock.
Right, the pandemic.
But does this 2020 to 2021 drop expose a fragility in how these aging populations are structured? Like, we clustered all these vulnerable people together.
It absolutely does expose a fragility. From an economic standpoint, putting elderly people in high-density retirement facilities makes sense. It's efficient.
Efficient for chronic care.
Exactly. But epidemiologically, you're basically building a perfect environment for a novel respiratory virus. We optimized the system for chronic disease, but left our flank completely open to traditional infectious shocks.
Wow. Okay, so we have this aging, top-heavy population, fewer young workers, soaring healthcare costs.
It's a lot of pressure.
It is. So how do you keep an economy growing when the workforce is aging and birth rates are dropping?
You have to fundamentally change how you make money. You stop making things and you start providing services.
Which brings us to the economic engine of these high-income countries.
Mm-hmm.
And the scale of the GDP here is just, it's hard to wrap my head around.
It's astronomical.
At 2015 constant prices, the total GDP expanded from $9.3 trillion in 1960 to $59.2 trillion in 2023.
And if you look at current prices for 2023, it sits at over $51.7 trillion.
Just a staggering concentration of wealth. But here's the catch. The growth slowdown is very real.
Right. The days of wild acceleration are over.
Annual growth rates plummeted from an average of 4 to 5% in the 1960s to a really sluggish 1 to 2% today.
I know 1 or 2% sounds bad compared to 5%, but we have to synthesize what this actually means.
Okay, tell me why I shouldn't think this is just total stagnation.
Because a 1% growth on a $50 trillion economy is still massive wealth creation.
Yeah.
We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars a year in new value.
Oh, right. The pie is so big now that a tiny slice is still huge.
Exactly. It reflects the characteristics of a mature economy. You've moved from the growth miracles like building your first national highway system to what we call inventory optimization.
Just making the existing system slightly more efficient.
Yeah. You can't double the size of the workforce anymore, so you squeeze out growth through marginal tech improvements and better resource allocation.
Okay, so let's talk about what that wealth actually feels like to the people living there. Because there's a really interesting gap in the data regarding prosperity and purchasing power.
The GNI data.
Right. So the current gross national income, or GNI per capita, is roughly $50,000.
Which sounds pretty comfortable.
It does. But when they adjust it for purchasing power parity PPP, that GNI shoots up to around 67,000 international dollars.
So what does this all mean for the listener?
Well, the difference between nominal wealth and actual purchasing power is key. $50,000 is just the exchange rate number. But PPP tells you what that money actually buys on the ground.
Right. It factors in the local cost of a haircut or rent or groceries.
Exactly. So because these high-income countries have such hyper-efficient domestic supply chains and service markets, your 50 grand actually buys you a lifestyle worth 67 grand in a baseline global context.
The system spreads the cost out and makes things cheaper for the consumer.
But, and this is a big good, but despite this vast wealth, the report highlights that a prosperity gap still exists internally within these nations.
Oh, absolutely. The wealth isn't evenly distributed at all.
Right. And a big reason for that inequality is the massive shift to services we mentioned earlier. The way people earn a living has totally transformed.
The death of agriculture and the decline of manufacturing.
Yeah, agriculture is virtually non-existent in terms of value add. It's only about 1.4% of GDP now.
It's all just hyper-mechanized.
In industrial value add factories, manufacturing, construction, that shrank from 27.3% in 2002 down to 22.2% in 2023.
It's a steady, decades-long decline.
Yeah.
So what filled the void?
Services. Services now dominate the economy, absorbing 74.6% of all employment, three-quarters of the workforce.
It's incredible.
I like to compare this to a tech company. High-income countries used to be the hardware factories. They built the physical stuff.
Right, the cars, the refrigerators.
Yeah, but now they are the software and cloud service providers of the world. They outsourced the heavy lifting and kept the design, the finance, the legal frameworks.
The algorithms, the intellectual property.
Exactly. They run the global operating system.
But to run a service-heavy, software-like economy, you need highly educated workers. You can't just throw unskilled labor at a financial derivative or a machine learning model.
Which brings us perfectly to the social fabric of these countries, education, labor, and this really striking gender divide.
The education data is fascinating here.
It really is an education triumph on the surface. Youth literacy is near 100% across the board. The gender parity index is totally stabilized at the primary school level. Boys and girls are getting equal basic education.
Which is a huge global achievement.
But then you look at higher education, and there's a massive flip.
The gender gap reverses.
Completely reverses. Female gross enrollment in higher education is at 91.9%. It has massively overtaken male enrollment, which is sitting back at 72.7%.
A nearly 20-point gap. This raises an important question, though.
What's that?
If women are vastly out-educating men, getting the degrees, mastering the skills required for a service economy, how is that reflected in the labor market? You expect them to dominate the workforce.
Right. You would totally expect that. But the labor market realities are shocking. Female labor force participation is hovering around 54.4%.
Which seems okay at a glance.
It seems okay until you look at the structure of that employment. There is a massive structural quirk. Female part-time employment is at 37.5%.
Wow, over a third.
Over a third of working women are in part-time roles, compared to just 22.5% for men.
Right.
This contradiction just blows my mind. Women are absolutely dominating higher education, but then they're getting bottlenecked into part-time work.
Well, if we connect this back to the demographic earthquake we talked about earlier, it starts to make a grim kind of sense.
The aging population.
Exactly. Think about it. Who is doing the part-time, unpaid care work?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. When you have an exploding population of elderly people who need chronic care and a system that can't fully support them, that burden falls on families. And historically and practically, that unpaid labor falls on women.
So these highly educated women are forced to dial back their careers to part-time just to fill the gaps in the social safety net taking care of aging parents or young kids.
Precisely. It's a massive loss of human capital for the economy and a huge structural burden on women.
That is just deeply unfair. And it's not just women falling through the cracks of this high-skill service economy.
The youth as well.
Yeah, the NEET youth. That stands for not in education, employment, or training.
Right.
The NEET rate is hovering around 11% in these high-income countries. More than 1 in 10 young people are just completely disconnected from the system.
Because the modern service economy is kind of a winner-takes-all market. In the old days, if school wasn't for you, you could go get a union job at a factory.
Right, you had a backup plan that still provided a middle-class life.
But with industry shrinking to 22%, those factory jobs are gone. If you don't have the high-level degree or the specialized tech skills, the drop-off is severe. You end up in precarious gig work, or you just drop out entirely.
Man, that's heavy. So you have this high-stress domestic situation, an aging population, a shrinking workforce, care burdens, and disconnected youth.
So how do they keep the whole thing from collapsing?
Exactly. With all these internal strains, high-income countries rely heavily on 2 external things to maintain their standard of living: hyper-innovation and hyper-globalization.
They have to dominate global trade.
And they do. Trade openness, which is trade as a percentage of GDP, peaked around 2008 at 50.5%, and it's basically plateaued there.
Half of their economy is tied to trade.
Yeah. But here's the most surprising data point in the whole report for me: the closed loop of their trade.
Oh, the intra-industry trade data.
Yes, because, wait, We always hear about globalization as this dynamic where rich countries buy cheap stuff from developing countries and then sell their expensive tech products back to those same developing countries.
Right, the classic core periphery model.
But the data says that is not what's happening.
Right.
Over 72% of manufactured exports from high-income countries go straight to other high-income countries.
They're mostly just trading with each other.
Exactly. It's a closed loop. Germany sells luxury cars to Japan. Japan sells robotics to Germany. They are just selling high-end stuff back and forth.
Well, it makes sense when you think about purchasing power. Who else can afford a $2 million MRI machine or a fleet of commercial airplanes?
Only other rich countries.
Right.
You need consumers with the $67,000 PPP to buy the goods your $50,000 workers are making.
It's an exclusive club, and to stay in that club, you have to be the absolute best at making those high-end products, which is why the tech engine is running so hot.
The scale of research and development is just insane. They are churning out over 600,000 resident patent applications annually.
600,000 a year.
Yeah. And the density of R&D personnel per million people is off the charts. They aren't trying to compete on cheap labor anymore. They're competing on who can invent the next generation of AI or quantum computing or biotech.
Because that intellectual property is the only moat protecting their $50 trillion service economy. If they lose the edge on innovation, the whole structure wobbles.
But all of this incredible wealth, the long life expectancy, the high technology, the massive trade networks, it has all come at a really steep environmental cost.
The ecological reckoning. We can't ignore the carbon footprint of all this wealth.
Right. So are high-income countries finally decoupling their wealth from their carbon footprint? Let's look at the climate action data.
There is some cautiously optimistic news here, actually.
There is. We finally saw a peak and a drop. Total CO2 emissions hit a plateau, a peak, around 2007 at approximately 15.7 billion tons.
And then it started coming down.
Yeah, it dropped to 15.5 billion tons by 2020. And it's not just CO2. Methane and nitrous oxide are also on long-term declining trends.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this represents went up. Emissions went up. They were locked together.
Right, you want to get richer, you burn more coal.
Exactly. But now, the GDP of these high-income nations went up while emissions finally started to bend down. It's a huge milestone.
And I know there's a but coming. Is it a real decoupling? Or did they just outsource the pollution?
Ah, carbon leakage.
Right, because we just talked about how they shrank their industrial sector. If Europe closes a steel mill and just imports that steel from a developing nation in Asia, Europe's emissions go down.
But global emissions stay the same or even go up.
Exactly, it's an accounting trick.
Well, it's partly an accounting trick, yes, carbon leakage is real. But there's also genuine technological efficiency happening. Better insulation, more efficient engines, the shift from coal to natural gas.
Okay, fair. But we need a serious energy reality check here. Because despite the good news on emissions peaking, the energy foundation of these countries is still deeply problematic.
Fossil fuels still dominate.
Heavily dominate. Between 1990 and 2015, the share of fossil fuels in their energy mix only dropped from 85.7% down to roughly 81%.
A 4% drop over 25 years.
Here's where it gets really interesting. These high-income countries are throwing parades, celebrating their emission drops, but they're still over 80% addicted to fossil fuels.
The energy transition is happening, but it is a profoundly slow turning of a massive ship.
I'd say it's harder than turning a ship. It's like trying to perform a heart transplant on a marathon runner while they are still running.
That's a great way to put it. You can't just stop the economy to rebuild the grid.
Right. You have $50 trillion of GDP depending on that energy. You can't just unplug the oil and gas pipelines.
And to be fair, the rise of renewables is happening. Non-hydro renewables grew from under 1% in 1990 to 5.3% in 2015.
It's exponential growth, but it's starting from such a tiny baseline.
Exactly. They have a massive mountain to climb to replace that 81%.
Okay, so we've covered a staggering amount of ground today. Looking at all this data from 1960 to today, we can really distill the future of these high-income countries down to 3 core pillars.
The storyline moving forward.
Exactly. Pillar number 1, demographic reshaping.
They have to adapt to the aging population. There's no way around it.
Right. They're going to have to rely heavily on automation, AI, and probably extending their retirement age just to keep the dependency ratio from crushing them.
It's going to be politically difficult, but economically necessary.
Pillar number 2, the green transition.
The agonizingly thorough shift we just talked about.
Yeah, moving from 80% fossil fuels to renewables. It is their only viable ecological path, and they have to accelerate it.
Because the current pace just isn't fast enough.
And finally, pillar number 3, the social contract.
This one is crucial. Maintaining a high-skill, service-driven society requires sustaining immense health and education services.
And fixing the structural imbalances, like freeing up those highly educated women from part-time care work traps.
Right. You can't waste that human capital if you want to stay competitive in a knowledge economy.
So to everyone listening right now, think about your own community. Are you seeing these signs?
The shift from factories to screens.
The aging populations, the scramble for green energy, it's all happening right in front of us.
It's the defining transition of our time.
It really is. And I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to ponder.
Let's hear it.
If the high-income model, this blueprint we just laid out, relies on enormous historical fossil fuel consumption to reach the top.
Which it absolutely did.
Right. And if it now requires demographic shrinking just to stabilize the system, can the rest of the world actually follow this exact path?
That is the big question.
Does the planet have the resources for that? Or does the global south have to invent a completely new, fundamentally different definition of what it means to be a high-income society?
A totally different paradigm, something to really think about.
Thank you all for taking this deep dive into the data with us. We'll catch you next time.